rain was coming down in sheets as Marcus drove through the deserted stretch of Highway 49. It was past midnight, and he'd been driving for 6 hours straight, desperate to get home before his wife's birthday ended. The windshield wipers struggled against the torrential downpour, and visibility was near zero. That's when he saw her. A young woman stood on the side of the road, soaked to the bone, thumb extended in the universal sign for help. Her pale dress clung to her thin frame, and her long black hair hung like wet curtains around her face. Against his better judgment, Marcus pulled over. "Need a ride?" he called out, rolling down the passenger window. She didn't speak, just climbed into the car with fluid, almost ghostly movements. "Where are you headed?" Marcus asked, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. "Just keep driving," she whispered, her voice like wind through dead leaves. "I'll tell you when to stop." Miles passed in uncomfortable silence. Marcus kept glancing at his passenger, but she sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead with unblinking eyes that reflected the highway lights like a nocturnal animal's. The radio crackled with static, occasionally picking up fragments of old songs from decades past. "Take the next exit," she suddenly commanded, as they approached exit 13, an exit Marcus was certain hadn't been there moments before. The road led to what appeared to be an abandoned rest stop. Broken windows gaped like hollow eye sockets, and weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete. A single flickering streetlight cast eerie shadows that seemed to move independently. "That's where it happened," the woman said, finally turning to look at Marcus. Her eyes were completely black, and her skin had turned a sickly gray. "This is where I died." Marcus tried to start the car, but the engine was dead. The woman continued speaking, her voice now echoing as if coming from a great distance. 30 years ago, on a night just like this, he picked me up just like you did, but he didn't want to just give me a ride. He brought me here, to this place, and when he was done with me, he left me to die in the rain." The car began filling with the smell of decay and standing water. Marcus grabbed the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The woman's face was inches from his now, her breath like grave dirt. "But every year on this night, I find someone to keep me company, someone to experience what I experienced, someone to join me in this place forever." The last thing Marcus saw was her skeletal grin, before everything went black. The next morning, a state trooper found an abandoned car at the old rest stop on Highway 49. The driver's license identified the body as Marcus Chen, but the strange thing was, he appeared to have been dead for weeks, not hours. And even stranger, there was no exit 13 on Highway 49. There never had been.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out, so subscribe now before the next nightmare finds you. Danny had been a long-haul trucker for 15 years, and he thought he'd seen everything the highway had to offer. He'd driven through blizzards that could bury a car, dodged drunk drivers weaving between lanes, and navigated roads so twisted, but nothing had prepared him for what he encountered on Interstate 80 that foggy October night. The fog had rolled in thick as cotton, reducing visibility to mere feet ahead of his massive rig. Danny had considered pulling over at the next truck stop, but he was already behind schedule, and the dispatcher had been breathing down his neck about delivery times, so he pressed on, crawling along at 20 miles per hour with his hazard lights flashing. 2 perfect circles of white light, maintaining the exact same distance behind him no matter how he adjusted his speed. When Danny sped up, the lights kept pace. When he slowed down, they maintained their position. Danny tried the CB radio, hoping to make contact with the mysterious driver. "Breaker 19, this is Big Danny on I-80 westbound. Come in, driver behind me." Static answered him, followed by a voice that seemed to echo from somewhere far away. "You can't outrun your sins, Danny boy." The blood in Danny's veins turned to ice. The voice knew his name, but more than that, it sounded exactly like his brother Tommy, who had died in a trucking accident 5 years ago, an accident that had been Danny's fault. The headlights began to get closer, impossibly close for the speed they were traveling. Danny pressed harder on the accelerator, but his speedometer needle refused to move past 25. The engine screamed, but the truck barely crawled forward through the supernatural fog. "Remember that night in Colorado, Danny?" The voice crackled through the CB again. "Remember how you were supposed to be driving, but you let me take the wheel because you were too drunk? Remember how you watched me go over that guardrail and never told anyone the truth?" Danny was crying now, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. The headlights were so close he could feel their heat through his rear window, even though that was impossible. In his side mirrors, he began to make out the shape of the vehicle behind him, a truck identical to the one Tommy had been driving that fateful night, the one that was now twisted metal at the bottom of a Colorado ravine. "I'm sorry, Tommy," Danny screamed into the radio. "I'm sorry I let you die. I'm sorry I lied to everyone." "Sorry doesn't bring back the dead, little brother," Tommy's voice whispered, now seeming to come from inside the cab itself. "But tonight, you get to join me." The phantom truck pulled alongside Danny's rig, and through the swirling fog, he could see Tommy behind the wheel. His brother's face was pale and bloodied, just as it had been when they pulled him from the wreckage. Tommy smiled and gave a little wave, the same gesture he'd always used when they passed each other on the highway during their living days. Then, Tommy's truck slammed into Danny's rig with the force of a freight train. When the fog cleared the next morning, state police found a jackknifed semi-truck wrapped around a bridge support. The driver, Daniel Morrison, was found dead in his cab, apparently from the impact. But investigators were puzzled by several things. There were no skid marks on the road, no evidence of another vehicle involved in the accident, and strangest of all, the CB radio was tuned to a frequency that had been out of service for over 20 years.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now before the next nightmare finds you. Sarah and her college roommate Jessica were driving back to campus after spring break when they took a wrong turn somewhere in the Nevada desert. The GPS had lost signal hours ago, and the last gas station they'd seen was a distant memory. The two-lane highway stretched endlessly in both directions, with nothing but scrubland and the occasional dead tree breaking the monotony. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Jessica asked, nervously fidgeting with her phone, hoping for even one bar of signal. "The road has to lead somewhere," Sarah replied, though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. They hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and the sun was beginning to set, painting the desert in ominous shades of red and orange. That's when they saw the mile marker. 666. "That's weird," Jessica muttered. "I've never seen a mile marker with that number before." Sarah felt a chill despite the desert heat. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Let's just keep driving. But as they continued down the highway, something impossible began to happen. The mile markers they passed were all the same, 666. Mile after mile, the same cursed number appeared on green metal signs, each one identical to the last. "This isn't possible," Sarah whispered, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. "We've been driving for 30 minutes. The markers should be changing." Jessica was frantically trying her phone again. Still no signal. And look at the GPS. It's not even showing us on any road. It's like we don't exist. The sun disappeared behind the horizon with unnatural speed, plunging them into darkness that seemed deeper and more oppressive than any night they'd ever experienced. Their headlights cut through the blackness, but seemed to illuminate only a few feet ahead, as if the darkness itself was actively pushing back against the light. That's when they started seeing the figures. At first, it was just shadows at the edge of their vision, tall, elongated shapes that seemed to move between the sparse desert vegetation. But as they continued driving past the endless mile marker 666, the figures became more distinct and more numerous. "Do you see those things?" Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper. "I saw them. Dozens of them now, walking alongside the highway just outside the reach of their headlights. They appeared to be human, but wrong somehow. Too tall, limbs too long, movements too fluid. And they all seemed to be keeping pace with the car, despite Sarah's foot pressing harder on the accelerator. "They're following us," Jessica whimpered. "Look behind us." In the rearview mirror, Sarah could see more figures filling the road behind them, an army of shadows marching in perfect silence. The speedometer read 80, then 90, then 100, but the figures never fell behind. Suddenly, the engine began to sputter. The fuel gauge, which had shown a quarter tank just minutes before, now registered empty. The car began to slow, and the figures drew closer. "No, no, no," Sarah chanted, frantically turning the key, but the engine was dead. The car coasted to a stop right beside another mile marker 666. In the sudden silence, they could hear something that made their blood freeze. The sound of hundreds of footsteps on asphalt, all moving in unison, all heading directly toward their car. The figures surrounded the vehicle, pressing their faces against the windows. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, Sarah and Jessica could see that the creatures had human features, but stretched and distorted like reflections in a funhouse mirror. Their eyes were completely black, and when they smiled, their mouths opened far too wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. One of the creatures tapped on the driver's side window with a finger that was far too long to be human. When Sarah looked directly at it, the thing mouthed a single word: "Welcome." The last entry in Sarah's diary, found later by search and rescue teams, read, "If you're reading this, don't look for us on Highway 375 in Nevada. There is no mile marker 666, but if you see one, turn around immediately. Whatever you do, don't stop. And don't trust your GPS when it tells you there's a shortcut through the desert. Some roads don't lead anywhere you want to go." Neither Sarah nor Jessica were ever found, despite extensive search efforts. And though Highway 375 runs for 98 miles through Nevada, search teams reported something odd. Every mile marker they checked was numbered correctly, except for one stretch of road where all the markers, 7 of them in a row, read 666.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now, before the next nightmare finds you.
Detective Ray Martinez had worked traffic fatalities for 12 years, but the case file sitting on his desk made him question everything he thought he knew about highway accidents. Over the past 6 months, there had been 17 single-vehicle crashes on a 20-mile stretch of Highway 101, all occurring between midnight and 3 a.m. The victims were all different ages, genders, and backgrounds, but every witness who survived described the same thing: a black sedan that appeared out of nowhere, forced them off the road, and then vanished. Ray decided to drive the highway himself, hoping to spot something the previous investigations had missed. He chose a rainy Thursday night, figuring the conditions might replicate those from several of the accidents. His unmarked police cruiser hummed along the empty highway as he carefully observed every shadow and reflective surface. At 12:47 a.m., he saw it. A black sedan with tinted windows materialized in his rear-view mirror as if it had been driving behind him all along, though Ray was certain the road had been empty moments before. The vehicle had no license plate, and its headlights seemed dimmer than they should be, casting an odd yellowish glow that barely illuminated the road ahead of it. Ray tried to get a better look at the driver, but the windows were too dark, and something about the sedan seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He attempted to radio for backup, but his radio produced only static, and his cell phone showed no signal. The black sedan began to accelerate, pulling alongside Ray's cruiser. Through his peripheral vision, he could see movement in the driver's seat, but when he turned to look directly, the windows appeared empty, as if the car was driving itself. Suddenly, the sedan swerved toward Ray's vehicle with aggressive intent. Ray yanked his steering wheel hard to the right, tires squealing as he fought to maintain control. The sedan matched his movements perfectly, continuing its relentless assault. Every time Ray tried to brake or accelerate, the phantom vehicle anticipated his actions with supernatural precision. Ray found himself being forced toward the guardrail at a dangerous curve overlooking a steep ravine, the same location where 8 of the previous 17 victims had crashed. The sedan was now driving so close that Ray could hear the roar of its engine, unnaturally loud and deep, like the growl of some massive predatory animal. In desperation, Ray drew his service weapon and fired 3 shots through his passenger window at the black sedan. The bullets seemed to pass right through the vehicle without effect, and the sedan responded by ramming into Ray's cruiser with tremendous force. Ray's car broke through the guardrail and began its deadly tumble down the rocky slope. As his vehicle rolled, Ray caught glimpses of the black sedan stopped at the edge of the highway above. For just a moment, he thought he could see the driver, a pale figure with hollow, staring eyes, and a smile that seemed to stretch across his entire face. Ray's cruiser came to rest upside down at the bottom of the ravine. Miraculously, he survived with only minor injuries. But when rescue teams arrived at dawn, they found something that would haunt Ray for the rest of his life. The black paint scraped from his cruiser during the encounter didn't match any known automotive paint. When analyzed, it contained traces of carbon dating back over a century. More disturbing still, the paint samples contained human DNA from 17 different individuals, matching exactly the DNA of every single victim who had died in crashes on that stretch of highway. Ray retired from the force 6 months later, but not before adding his own report to the growing file. His final entry read, "The black sedan isn't trying to cause accidents, it's collecting them. Each crash, each death makes it stronger, more real. And I think it's been driving that highway a lot longer than any of us realized." Local records show that the first reported sighting of a mysterious black sedan on Highway 101 dates back to 1924, just 3 years after the highway was completed. The witness was a traveling salesman named Harold Voss, who claimed a black automobile forced his Model T Ford off the road at the exact same curve where Ray Martinez nearly died. Harold Voss was found dead at the bottom of the ravine. The cause of his crash was listed as driver error, but his final words to the rescue team were recorded by a local newspaper. "It's still up there, waiting for the next one." The highway remains open, and the crashes continue.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now before the next nightmare finds you.
Jake had been driving for 14 straight hours when he saw the sign, "Last Chance Rest Up, 2 miles." His eyelids felt like sandpaper, and his hands were cramping from gripping the steering wheel. The digital clock on his dashboard read 2:33 a.m., and the highway stretched endlessly through the empty Montana wilderness. The rest stop appeared exactly where the sign promised, a small, dimly lit facility with a few parking spaces and a single building housing restrooms and vending machines. Jake pulled into the deserted lot, grateful for the chance to stretch his legs and grab some caffeine. As he walked toward the building, he noticed something odd. Despite being the only car in the lot, he could hear voices coming from inside, muffled conversations and what sounded like children laughing. The fluorescent lights inside flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows on the windows. Jake pushed open the heavy metal door and stepped inside. The voices stopped immediately, as if someone had suddenly muted a television. The silence was deafening and unnatural. The vending machines hummed softly in the corner, their displays casting an eerie blue glow across the cracked tile floor. The men's restroom door stood slightly ajar, and Jake could see that one of the stalls was occupied. He could see feet under the door, wearing what appeared to be old-fashioned leather boots. But the feet weren't touching the ground. They hung about 6 inches above the floor, swaying slightly as if the person was suspended? "Hello?" Jake called out hesitantly. "Everything okay in there?" No response. The feet continued their gentle swaying motion. Jake backed away from the restroom and turned to the vending machines, hoping to grab a Coke and get back on the road as quickly as possible, but what he saw made his blood freeze. The vending machine was stocked with items that shouldn't exist. Coca-Cola in glass bottles with logos from the 1950s, candy bars with packaging he'd never seen before, and newspapers dated from decades past. He selected a Coke, inserted his quarters, and watched the bottle tumble down. When he bent to retrieve it, he noticed something horrifying reflected in the glass. Behind him, the restroom was now full of people. Dozens of them, all standing perfectly still, all staring directly at him. He spun around, but the restroom appeared empty again. Just those strange boots still swaying under the stall door. He grabbed his Coke and rushed toward the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but the door felt like it was sealed shut. Panic began to set in as he pulled harder, the metal handle cutting into his palms. "You can't leave yet," came a voice from behind him. "You haven't signed the guest book." Jake turned to see an elderly man in a gas station attendant uniform, complete with a name tag that read Earl. The man's skin was gray and mottled, and his eyes were completely white, like cataracts had consumed his entire iris. "Every visitor has to sign," Earl continued.
pointing to a dusty ledger book that sat on a small table Jake was certain hadn't been there moments before. It's the rule. Jake looked at the open book, the signatures stretched back decades, written in different handwriting styles and fading inks. But what made his stomach lurch was that every single entry was dated with the same time, 2:33 a.m. "I don't understand," he whispered. Earl smiled, revealing teeth that looked like broken glass. "This is where they stop, son. All the tired drivers, all the ones who fall asleep at the wheel. This is their last stop before the real journey begins." Jake looked back at the vending machine's glass and saw them all clearly now. Hundreds of people filling the small rest stop, all staring at him with the same white, cataract eyes. Men, women, children, all wearing clothes from different eras, all completely silent. "Sign the book, Jake," Earl said, somehow knowing his name. "Then you can rest. Forever." Jake's hand moved toward the pen as if controlled by invisible strings. He could feel the exhaustion pulling at him, promising eternal sleep, no more long drives, no more deadlines, no more... With tremendous effort, he jerked his hand away and threw himself at the door. This time it opened, spilling him out into the cold night air. He ran to his car, fumbling with the keys, hearing Earl's laughter echoing behind him. Jake's car started on the first try, and he peeled out of the parking lot, gravel spraying behind him. In his rearview mirror, he watched the rest stop fade into darkness, as if it was slowly dissolving back into the night. 20 miles down the road, he stopped at a 24-hour truck stop and asked the cashier about the last chance rest stop. The young woman looked at him strangely. "There's no rest stop between here and the state line. Hasn't been one for over 30 years. They closed it down after too many accidents. People kept falling asleep right after leaving there. Some kind of gas leak, they figured." Jake never drove that route again. But sometimes, late at night, when he's fighting to stay awake on long drives, he can still taste that Coca-Cola. Flat, warm, and somehow wrong. Like it had been sitting in that vending machine for decades, waiting for the next tired driver to stop and sign the book.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now, before the next nightmare finds you. Dr. Emma Rodriguez was driving home from a late surgery when she first noticed the extra lane. It was just past midnight on Highway 27, a route she'd taken hundreds of times over her 10-year career at the county hospital. The new lane was dimly lit by streetlights that cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. No other cars traveled in it, and Emma found herself inexplicably drawn to merge over. As a rational person of science, she knew she should be questioning what she was seeing, but exhaustion from the 12-hour surgery made critical thinking feel impossible. She signaled and moved into the mysterious lane. The moment her tires crossed the lane markers, everything changed. The radio, which had been playing soft jazz, suddenly filled with static, punctuated by voices speaking in what sounded like backward language. The temperature inside her car dropped noticeably, and her breath began to fog, despite the heater running full blast. Emma tried to merge back into the normal lanes, but every time she attempted to change lanes, her steering wheel would fight against her, as if the car had developed its own will. The lane markers seemed to glow with an otherworldly light, creating an invisible barrier she couldn't cross. The speedometer showed she was traveling at exactly 55 miles per hour, but the sensation was all wrong.
The landscape outside moved too slowly, as if she were crawling rather than driving highway speed. Trees and billboards passed by in dreamlike slow motion, and she began to notice that some of the billboards displayed advertisements for businesses that had closed decades ago. That's when she saw the other cars. They appeared gradually, like photographs slowly developing in a dark room. Vintage vehicles from different eras filled the ghostly third lane. A 1970s Camaro with rust eating through its yellow paint, a 1960s Volkswagen Beetle with a cracked windshield, and a 1950s Cadillac with tail fins that gleamed despite the decay covering the rest of the vehicle. Each car contained a driver, and as Emma looked more closely, she could see that something was terribly wrong with all of them. The woman in the Beetle had her head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if her neck had been snapped. The man in the Cadillac had a massive dent in the side of his skull, and dark liquid trickled from his ears. The teenager in the Camaro was missing the entire left side of his face. They were all staring at her. Emma pressed harder on the accelerator, but her speed remained constant. She tried the brakes, but the pedal felt spongy and unresponsive. The ghostly convoy maintained perfect formation around her, their damaged occupants never taking their eyes off her car. The radio static began to clear, and she could make out individual voices. "Welcome to the accident lane, Doctor. You can't save us now. Join us, join us, join us." Emma realized with growing horror that she recognized some of the voices. Patients she'd lost on the operating table, victims of highway accidents she'd failed to save in the ER. They were all here, in this impossible lane that existed between life and death. A massive semi-truck materialized ahead of her, jackknifed across all the lanes. She was going to crash, and there was nothing she could do about it. The truck grew larger and larger in her windshield, and she could see the driver, a man she'd pronounced dead just 6 months ago after a failed heart surgery. Emma closed her eyes and braced for impact. She woke up in her own bed, sunlight streaming through her bedroom windows. Her car keys were on her nightstand, and she was still wearing her scrubs from the night before. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion? But when she went to her car, she found proof that the nightmare had been real. Her fuel gauge, which had been nearly full when she left the hospital, now read empty. The odometer showed she'd driven exactly 47 miles, the precise distance from the hospital to her home via Highway 27. And stuck under her windshield wiper was a business card for a funeral home that had been closed since 1987, with a handwritten note on the back. "Thank you for visiting our lane. We'll be seeing you again soon." Emma never drove Highway 27 at night again, but it didn't matter. Every highway has a vanishing lane, and once you've seen it, once you've driven in it, it can find you anywhere. Other doctors at the hospital began to notice that Emma's patient mortality rate was climbing, and she couldn't explain why she seemed to be losing people she should have been able to save. Late at night, when she's alone in the OR fighting to save a life, Emma sometimes hears the radio static and feels the temperature drop. She knows that somewhere, on some impossible stretch of highway that exists between heartbeats, the vanishing lane is waiting for her to take that final drive. And every patient she loses becomes another driver in that ghostly convoy, another voice in the static, calling her name and asking her to join them in the lane that leads to nowhere and everywhere at once.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now before the next nightmare finds you.
State Trooper Lisa Chen had patrolled Highway 89 for 8 years without incident, until the night she discovered Mile Zero. According to all maps and official records, Highway 89 began at mile marker 1 and ended at mile marker 127. There was no Mile Zero. There had never been a Mile Zero. But there it was, standing like a monument to impossibility beside the dark asphalt, a green highway marker bearing the number 0 in reflective white numerals. Lisa pulled her patrol car to the shoulder and stepped out to examine the sign. It looked identical to every other mile marker on the highway. Same font, same materials, same mounting hardware. But according to her GPS, she was parked at mile marker 15. And when she looked back down the road, she could see mile marker 1 exactly where it should be, about 14 miles behind her. She radioed dispatch to report the anomaly, but her radio produced only static. Her cell phone showed no signal despite being in an area with normally excellent coverage. The silence of the empty highway seemed to press against her ears like physical weight. Lisa decided to investigate further. She got back in her patrol car and drove past Mile Zero, watching her odometer carefully. After exactly 1 mile, she expected to see mile marker 1, but instead found another Mile Zero, then another, and another. Every mile marker on the highway now read 0. She turned around and headed back the way she'd come, but the markers still read 0 in both directions. It was as if the entire highway had been reset to some impossible starting point, an endless loop of Mile Zero markers stretching into infinity. That's when she noticed the other patrol car. It was parked on the opposite shoulder, exactly where she'd been parked minutes before. Lisa pulled over and walked toward the vehicle, her hand instinctively moving to her service weapon. The car was identical to hers, same year, same model, same department markings. But when she peered through the driver's side window, her blood turned to ice. She was looking at herself. Another Lisa Chen sat behind the wheel, staring straight ahead with vacant eyes. This other Lisa wore the same uniform, had the same badge, even had the same small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. But this Lisa's skin was pale gray, and her eyes were completely black. "You're in Mile Zero now," the other Lisa said, without moving her lips, her voice somehow coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "This is where all the highways begin and where they all end." Lisa backed away from the car, but found herself moving in slow motion, as if the air around Mile Zero had become thick as molasses. More patrol cars began to appear along the highway, dozens of them, all containing versions of herself. Some looked recently dead, others appeared to have been decaying for years. "Every time you drive past Mile Zero, another one of you stays behind," the collective voices of her doppelgangers explained. "Every choice, every route, every decision creates a new you, and eventually, all versions end up here." Lisa ran to her patrol car and started the engine, desperate to escape this nightmare realm. But as she drove, she could see in her rearview mirror that one version of herself remained behind, standing beside the Mile Zero marker with the same vacant expression as all the others. She drove for what felt like hours, passing countless Mile Zero signs, until finally, miraculously, she saw mile marker 1 ahead, then mile marker 2. The normal sequence had returned, and her radio crackled back to life. "Unit 47, what's your location?" came the dispatcher's voice. "Mile marker 15 on Highway 89, Lisa responded, her voice shaking. "Unit 47, you've been off radio for 6 hours. Are you all right?" Lisa looked at her watch.
It was still the same time it had been when she first stopped at mile 0, 11:43 p.m. But according to dispatch, 6 hours had passed. She never filed a report about mile 0, and she never spoke about what she'd seen. But every night, when she patrolled Highway 89, she counted the mile markers obsessively, terrified that she might see that impossible 0 again. Lisa retired from the force 2 years later, officially due to stress-related health issues. But the real reason was simpler and more terrifying. Every night, in her dreams, she found herself driving past mile 0, and each time, she left another version of herself behind. And sometimes, when she's driving on any highway late at night, Lisa catches glimpses in her peripheral vision of patrol cars that shouldn't be there, all containing women who look exactly like her, all following at a respectful distance, all waiting for her to find her way back to mile 0, where all the highways begin and all the journeys end. The other versions of herself are patient. They know that eventually, every road leads back to 0.
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now, before the next nightmare finds you.